a black teen in a desperate situation, a crying white baby, a racist cop. This is a story of courage, bias, and the power of truth. Terrence sat on the living room couch, flipping through his textbook while keeping an ear out for Noah, who was playing with his toys on the floor. The night had been peaceful so far, just like every other time he had babysat for Dr. Whitman. She trusted him completely, and he took that responsibility seriously. Dr. Whitman, a busy pediatrician, had called him earlier in the evening, explaining that she had been called into an emergency surgery and wouldn't be home until late. Terrence had reassured her that everything was under control. He had been babysitting Noah for nearly a year, and by now the little boy felt like family. But then everything changed. Noah, usually full of energy, suddenly clutched his stomach and whimpered. Terrence glanced over and saw the boy's face twist in pain. "What's wrong, buddy?" he asked, setting his book aside. Noah didn't answer. Instead, he let out a weak cough and slumped onto his side. Terrence's heart pounded as he rushed over. He pressed a hand against Noah's forehead and felt the alarming heat radiating off his skin. "You're burning up," he murmured, trying to keep his voice calm. He scooped the boy into his arms and carried him to the couch. "Hey, Noah, look at me," he said gently. But Noah's eyelids fluttered, his tiny frame trembling. Terrence grabbed his phone, quickly dialing Dr. Whitman's number. It went straight to voicemail. Panic threatened to creep in, but he forced himself to stay level-headed. He couldn't wait for her to call back. Noah needed a doctor now. Terrence glanced at the clock, nearly midnight. He knew calling an ambulance might take too long, and he didn't have time to waste. There was only one option. He grabbed Dr. Whitman's spare car keys from the counter. She had told him more than once, "If there's ever an emergency, don't hesitate to use my car." He had never imagined needing to, but this was exactly that, an emergency. With steady hands, he wrapped Noah in a blanket, lifted him carefully, and carried him outside. The crisp night air hit his face as he hurried to the car, adjusting Noah in his arms to unlock the door. He strapped the weak, feverish boy into the back seat, and then slid behind the wheel. The hospital wasn't far, but every second counted. As he gripped the steering wheel, he took a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew what this looked like. A black teenager driving a white woman's car in the middle of the night with a pale, unconscious child in the back seat. It didn't matter that Dr. Whitman had trusted him. It didn't matter that he was doing the right thing. He had heard enough stories to know how quickly people could jump to conclusions. Terrence shook the thought away and turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, and he pulled out of the driveway. His only focus now was getting Noah to safety. The consequences of how others might see him, he'd deal with that later. As he sped toward the hospital, the streetlights casting long shadows across the empty road, a new fear gripped him. Not just for Noah's life, but for his own. Because in this world, doing the right thing wasn't always enough. Terrence had always taken his responsibilities seriously. From the first time Dr. Whitman had asked him to babysit Noah, he had treated it like more than just a job. He had seen the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she juggled long hospital shifts while trying to be the best mother she could. She had no family nearby to help, and though she never said it outright, Terrence knew she depended on him. Over time, their relationship had grown beyond that of an employer and babysitter. Dr. Whitman trusted him with her son, her home, and her peace of mind. She had once told him, "I don't think I could do this without you," and that had meant everything. It wasn't just about watching Noah. It was about knowing he was someone who mattered. For Terence, that trust meant everything. He had worked hard to prove himself in a world that often made it difficult for black boys like him to be seen as responsible, trustworthy, or capable. Babysitting wasn't just a side gig. It was a role he took with pride, one that showed he could be relied on, that he was more than just another teenager. But trust didn't always extend beyond the people who knew him. Officer Harding had been a presence in the neighborhood for years, and his reputation preceded him. He was the kind of cop who saw what he wanted to see. To him, a black teen behind the wheel of a nice car in the middle of the night wasn't a concerned babysitter rushing a sick child to the hospital. It was a crime in progress. Harding was known for making assumptions, and once he made up his mind, he rarely backed down. The community whispered about the people he had stopped for looking suspicious, or the times he had escalated situations that never should have been confrontational in the first place. He wasn't violent, not outright, but his presence carried the weight of someone who had the power to make life difficult for anyone who didn't fit his narrow view of who belonged and who didn't. Terence had never had a run-in with Harding before, but he had heard the stories. He had seen the looks the officer gave people like him, had watched from a distance when Harding had pulled over his older cousin for simply driving home from work. He had seen how quickly respectability meant nothing, how fast a person could go from innocent to suspect. And now, as he drove toward the hospital with Noah barely conscious in the back seat, he knew exactly what this looked like. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets empty except for the glow of traffic lights and the occasional parked car. But even in that silence, Terence felt the weight of what could go wrong. The hospital wasn't far, but all it would take was one moment, one wrong turn, one officer with the wrong mindset to change everything. He kept his hands steady on the wheel, his breath measured. This wasn't about him. It was about Noah. The baby needed medical attention, and there was no time to hesitate. He wasn't breaking any laws. He wasn't doing anything wrong. But that didn't mean he wouldn't be treated like he was. As the hospital came into view, a flash of red and blue lights reflected in his rearview mirror. His stomach dropped. Even before he heard the siren, he knew. Officer Harding had seen him. The importance of this moment was no longer just about Noah's health. It was about proving himself in a way he never should have had to. It was about fighting against an assumption that had already been made before he even had the chance to speak. Terence took a deep breath and slowed the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel just a little tighter. Because now, he wasn't just a babysitter rushing a child to the hospital. He was a suspect. How do you think Terence felt when he realized he was being wrongly accused? Let us know your thoughts. Terence's hands gripped the steering wheel as he glanced in the rearview mirror. Noah's whimpers had grown weaker, and every second counted. The hospital was only a few blocks away, glowing like a beacon in the night, but the red and blue lights flashing behind him made it feel impossibly far. His heart pounded. This couldn't be happening. He slowed the car and pulled over, his mind racing. He had done nothing wrong, but that didn't matter. He had seen situations like this before, heard the stories, watched the news. A black teen behind the wheel of a white woman's car with a pale, sick child in the back seat. It didn't take much to guess what this looked like to an officer like Harding. Before he could even reach for the window controls, the officer was already out of his patrol car, hand resting on his holster. Terence swallowed hard, keeping his hands visible on the wheel. He knew the drill, no sudden movements, no reaching, just stay calm. The tap on the window came hard, abrupt. Terence rolled it down, his voice tight. "Officer, please, I—" "Step out of the vehicle," Harding ordered, cutting him off. His voice carried the weight of authority, but also something else, assumption. Terence's stomach knotted. "Sir, I need to get to the hospital," he said quickly, trying to keep his voice steady. "The baby in the back. He's really sick." Harding didn't even glance toward the back seat. His eyes were locked on Terence, narrowed with suspicion. "I said, step out." Terence hesitated. If he got out, would he even get the chance to explain? Noah let out a weak cry from the back, a sound so faint it sent a new wave of panic through Terence. "Look, I don't have time for this," he pleaded. "I'm babysitting for Dr. Whitman. This is her son. I just need to get him to the hospital." But Harding wasn't listening. His hand was already reaching for his radio. "Dispatch. I have a possible child abduction in progress," he said, his tone sharp, sending an icy chill through Terence's veins. "No, no, no, you don't understand." Terence's voice cracked as his fear bubbled over. His pulse was hammering in his ears. "I didn't take him. I'm trying to help him." Harding took a step closer, eyes narrowing. "Out of the car, now." Terence clenched his jaw, his entire body shaking. He could feel the weight of the moment crushing him, pressing him into a place where no words, no reason, no truth would matter. Harding had already made up his mind. Noah's cries grew louder, small gasps in between as his tiny body struggled against the fever. "Officer, please. I'm just trying to save him," Terence shouted, desperation in every syllable. For a split second, something flickered across Harding's face. A hesitation. Then, another voice cut through the tense night air. "What's going on here?" Terence turned his head sharply. A woman was running toward them, her blonde hair disheveled, eyes wild with panic. Dr. Whitman! Her presence hit like a lightning strike. She reached the car, barely glancing at Harding before yanking the door open and reaching for Noah. "Oh my God, Noah! Terence, what happened?" Harding froze. "Dr. Whitman?" His posture stiffened, confusion clouding his expression. Dr. Whitman turned, finally noticing Harding, and her face twisted in disbelief. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Terence was taking my son to the hospital. He just called me." The color drained from Harding's face. His hand, still hovering near his holster, slowly fell to his side. Terence exhaled sharply, his entire body sagging as the tension in his chest released all at once. Harding stepped back, his throat clearing. I didn't realize." Dr. Whitman wasn't listening. She was already checking Noah, cradling him close. "He's burning up," she whispered. Then she looked at Terence, eyes full of gratitude. "Get in the car. We need to go, now." Terence didn't hesitate. He ducked back into the driver's seat, his hands still shaking as he gripped the wheel. As they pulled away, he dared one last glance in the mirror. Harding stood frozen in place, his radio still in his hand. Maybe for the first time he was questioning his instincts. What time is it, and where are you watching from? Share in the comments. The baby's cries pierced through the cold night air, the weak gasps now frantic. Terence felt like the walls were closing in, his desperation mounting. He had never felt so powerless, standing between his urgent need to help Noah and an officer who saw him as a threat rather than a terrified teenager trying to save a life. Officer Harding's stance remained rigid, his expression unreadable, but something in his eyes flickered. Hesitation, doubt. The sound of Noah's worsening cries reached a fevered pitch, cutting through the moment like a knife. Terence's panic had been clear from the start, but it was the baby's distress that forced Harding to take pause. The officer shifted uncomfortably, finally glancing toward the back seat where Noah's tiny face was flushed red, his little chest rising and falling too quickly. A shiver of realization passed through Harding's rigid frame. For the first time since pulling Terence over, he truly saw the child in distress. Terence barely noticed the shift. He was too focused on the baby, his instincts screaming at him to move. He clenched his fists, his breathing heavy. "Please," he begged, his voice hoarse. "Noah needs a hospital." Harding hesitated a second longer before finally stepping back. Without a word, he turned toward his squad car, his movements sharp and purposeful. The sound of his radio crackled as he muttered something into it, his voice barely audible over the pounding in Terence's ears. Then, suddenly, the red and blue lights flashed even brighter. "Get in," Harding ordered, nodding toward the driver's seat. "I'm escorting you to the hospital." Terence didn't wait to process what had just happened. He scrambled into the car, heart still pounding as he started the engine. Harding's cruiser pulled ahead, its sirens blaring as it cleared the way. Terence barely breathed the entire drive. The normally long streets blurred past in streaks of neon, the speedometer higher than he had ever dared to push. Every few seconds, he glanced at the rearview mirror where Noah lay still in his car seat, his cries weaker now, his little hands curling and uncurling. "Just hold on," Terence whispered, gripping the wheel. "We're almost there." The hospital came into view like a lifeline, its bright emergency entrance cutting through the night. As soon as Terence pulled up, doctors and nurses rushed outside, their faces set in focus. Dr. Whitman was already there, her coat barely on her shoulders, her hair pulled into a messy bun. The moment she spotted the car, she ran toward it, her breath caught somewhere between relief and terror. "Where is he?" she gasped. Terence threw open the back door, stepping aside as the doctors reached in for Noah. Dr. Whitman's hands trembled as she touched her son, her relief breaking into sobs as she pressed her lips against his forehead. "He's burning up," one of the doctors said urgently. "Let's move him inside." Terence stepped back, watching as they rushed into the hospital, his hands still shaking. His body felt like it had been stretched to its limit, but he couldn't move, couldn't breathe properly. Then he noticed Harding standing nearby. The officer was stiff, his lips pressed into a thin line, but his eyes weren't cold anymore. They were searching, conflicted. For the first time that night, he seemed to see Terence not as a suspect but as a human being, one who had done everything right, despite everything working against him. Dr. Whitman turned sharply, her eyes locking onto Harding. "You almost cost my son his life," she said, her voice shaking with anger. Harding didn't argue. He didn't offer excuses. He only swallowed hard, nodding once. "I know," he admitted, his voice unusually quiet. Terence exhaled slowly, his pulse still racing, his thoughts still catching up with everything that had happened. He had spent years knowing that people like Harding made judgments about him before he even opened his mouth. And tonight, those judgments had nearly stopped him from saving Noah. But for the first time, Terence saw something he hadn't expected. Harding was questioning himself. For once, he didn't just assume. He listened. Terence wasn't sure if it changed anything in the long run. But tonight, it was enough. Word of the night's events spread faster than Terence could have imagined. By the next morning, local news outlets were already covering the story. How a teenage boy had risked everything to save a child's life, only to be stopped by a police officer's wrongful assumptions. Dr. Whitman didn't hesitate to make sure everyone knew the truth. At the hospital, she stood in front of a group of reporters, Noah sleeping peacefully in her arms, and recounted every detail. She spoke about how Terence had always been responsible, how he had cared for Noah like family, and how, when it mattered most, he had done the right thing. But she didn't stop there. She turned her focus to Officer Harding, making it clear that her son's life had been put at risk, not just by his illness, but by prejudice. If Officer Harding had taken 1 second to listen, instead of assuming the worst, we wouldn't have almost lost precious time, she said firmly. Terence is not just a good kid, he's a hero, and it's time we start seeing young black men like him for who they truly are, instead of through the lens of fear and bias. The town, which had long overlooked the quiet injustices that people like Terence faced, was now forced to confront them head-on. The incident ignited conversations that had been ignored for far too long. At grocery stores, in barbershops, and in schools, people talked about how quickly Harding had jumped to conclusions. Some admitted they had done the same in their own lives, realizing how dangerous such prejudices could be. Meanwhile, Harding himself couldn't escape the weight of what had happened. He sat in his patrol car outside the hospital for what felt like hours, watching people come and go, seeing how many came to check on Terence and thank him. It made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't fully explain. The pride he once had in his job now felt tainted by the realization that he had nearly let a child suffer because of his own bias. That evening, after much hesitation, Harding found himself standing outside Terence's front door. He took a deep breath before knocking, the sound echoing through the small house. When the door opened, Terence stood there, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Harding cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Terence didn't say anything, just waited. Harding shifted uncomfortably. "I was wrong," he admitted. "I let my assumptions guide my actions instead of the facts. I didn't listen to you, and I nearly cost that little boy his life. That's on me." Terence studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "Yeah, it is." Harding exhaled sharply. "I don't expect forgiveness," he continued, "but I do want you to know I'm going to do better. I have to." There was another pause, and then Terence finally spoke. "Good," he said, "because there are a lot of kids like me out there. And next time, they might not have proof to save themselves." Harding had nothing to say to that, because he knew it was true. In the days that followed, the story continued to spread, but it wasn't just about what had gone wrong. It became about the change that followed. People in the community, who had once looked at Terence with suspicion, now saw him for what he truly was, an intelligent, selfless young man who had done something extraordinary. Local organizations stepped forward to offer him scholarships, mentorship programs, and opportunities he had never thought possible. His story reached beyond the town, inspiring conversations about racial bias in law enforcement and how people could work toward genuine change. For the first time in his life, Terence wasn't just seen. He was respected. As he sat on the hospital's rooftop one evening, looking out over the city, he let out a deep breath. He hadn't wanted to be a hero. He had just wanted to do the right thing. But if his actions meant people would finally start questioning their own assumptions, maybe it had all been worth it. In the distance, the city lights flickered, each one representing a life, a story. And for the first time in a long time, Terence believed that his own story was just beginning. Terence never set out to be a hero. He never imagined that one night, one decision, would force an entire town to rethink the way it saw people like him. He only knew one thing for certain. When someone needed help, You didn't stop to ask if people would believe you. You just acted. The town, once divided by deep-seated prejudices, now had to confront its own reflection. The story of Terence and Noah spread far beyond the community, sparking discussions about the dangers of racial bias and the assumptions that could have cost an innocent child his life. Parents began to question what they were teaching their children. Officers sat through new training programs, and people who had never given racial injustice a second thought found themselves reconsidering their beliefs. It was uncomfortable for many, but necessary. Officer Harding's apology was just the beginning. Though he could never undo the damage of that night, his willingness to acknowledge his mistake became a lesson for others. He started listening more, judging less, and speaking out when he saw other officers making the same assumptions he once had. Change, however slow, had begun. For Terence, the experience reshaped his life in ways he never expected. In the weeks following the incident, colleges and community leaders reached out, offering scholarships and mentorships. Suddenly, doors that had always been closed to him were beginning to open. He had always known his worth, but now the world was starting to recognize it too. But for Terence, the greatest reward wasn't the recognition or the opportunities. It was knowing that, because of his actions, Noah was alive. That was all that had ever mattered. As he sat outside Dr. Whitman's house one evening, watching Noah giggle in her arms, he felt something shift within him. The weight of years of judgment and struggle wasn't gone, but it felt lighter. He had done something that mattered. And no one, not Officer Harding, not the people who had once doubted him, could take that away. Noah, as if sensing his thoughts, reached out his tiny hand. Terence smiled, letting the child wrap his fingers around his own. One act of kindness. One moment of bravery. That was all it had taken to change everything. And maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning.